Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to Milton Keynes Lit Fest Online. This is the fifth, I think, of our 2021 spring and summer online season. We have 3 or 4 more events left to run, and I shall put the link to the website into the chat window for you as we go through. But we are delighted this evening to be joined by Chris Bryant, MP for the Rhondda Valley, who will be talking about his splendid book, The Glamour Boys. I came across this at the recommendation of Uli Lennart, who's one of the main buyers at the Ever Splendid Goes the Word bookshop, who made it one of his book choices of the year. At which point I said to my other half, who's also with us this evening, that looks like a really good Christmas present. Can I have a copy of that, please? And I promptly spent most of Boxing Day and the day after engrossed in this, discovering a whole era of British politics and what was really happening very much behind the scenes, as we will find out along the way. So I'm particularly delighted that Chris was able to join us this evening to tell us more about it. We will be taking your questions at the end of the event. So if you have a question for Chris from anything that arises that we talk, or anything that you would like to ask about the book, pop it into the chat window as we go ahead, and me and John will monitor that, and we'll try and get as many of your questions answered at the end of the session as we can. We'll also provide you with a link if you haven't read the book, and shame on you, but you would at the end of this like to go and buy a copy, which I would very much recommend. We'll give you a link so that you can do that. You can buy signed copies from Chris's own website, and the proceeds from those sales go to a local charity. So you'll be getting yourself a good book and doing a good turn. But let me start with the first question to Chris. I'm aware from having listened to podcasts and other interviews you've given about the book, there was a sentence that you came across that was the spark for the intrigue to research this whole story. And it's really quite a sentence, if you can recall it, Chris.
Yes, so I was writing a history of Parliament, which was published a few years ago. And I came across this, I was doing the bit about the Second World War, and I came across this sentence about a Conservative MP called Jack McNamara. And it said, Colonel Jack McNamara was a right-wing, almost fascist Conservative Member of Parliament for Chelmsford. He employed Guy Burgess as his researcher and used to go on sex tours of Paris and Berlin with Guy Burgess, who was later obviously revealed to be a Soviet spy, with his lover, the Anglican Archdeacon Herbert Sharp, and with other friends. And on one occasion, this included playing table tennis across a dining room table where the part of the net was taken by a very finely proportioned Belgian professional cyclist who was lying on the table naked. And that was just sort of somehow quite intriguing.
You kind of want to know more, don't you?
Yes, and indeed. And I mean, I think that some of that is not quite right about Jack. Jack McNamara was indeed a Tory MP for Chelmsford from 1935 until his death in December 1944. But he did employ Guy Burgess, and they certainly did go on lots of trips to Germany. He was part of a bunch of Tory MPs who really wanted Britain to have a rapprochement with Germany in the early 1930s, because they thought, well, this is one of the great countries in the world. We should be natural allies, not opponents. We don't want to go back to war with them ever again. But when I did a lot more research, and it's certainly true that he had an affair with the Anglican Archdeacon Herbert Sharp, because Herbert Sharp's daughter has given kind of chapter and verse on all of that. But I don't think that Jack was a fascist. He certainly knew members of the Nazi party. There were quite a lot of gay Nazis at the beginning of the Nazi sort of rise to power in the early 1930s. and I think his mind was changed dramatically in March 1936 when he went to Germany to celebrate, which is unusual, the remilitarization of the Rhineland by Hitler, and thereby breaking the Versailles Treaty. And he says in his autobiography, he accidentally visits Dachau. And I think there at Dachau, he doesn't say this in his autobiography, but he would have seen gay men imprisoned. It's the first place that they were imprisoned for their sexuality, alongside Jews, political prisoners, and others. And he saw quite a lot of the violence, and I think it profoundly shocked him and changed his mind. And then once I'd sort of opened up the curtain on Jack, I discovered a whole load of other men who, at the beginning of the 1930s, liked visiting Germany a lot because it was not, well, theoretically, it was illegal in Germany to engage in homosexual acts. But in practice, that was in the German Penal Code, Article 175. But the Social Democratic government in Prussia, which included Berlin, was clear that they would not implement that law. And that's what allowed this enormous flourishing during what was known as the Weimar Republic of all these gay bars, nightclubs, saunas, Turkish bars, gay restaurants. I mean, pretty anything you wanted. And it meant that all these men could go to Germany and have sex, which was completely illegal in the UK, because at the time the law stipulated that you could be done under a series of different offences, including the ancient one that existed since the time of Henry VIII of buggery, but more importantly, you could be done for gross indecency, which was a clause that had been introduced in the 1880s into an act, and it was so ill specified in the law that you could be done for next to anything. And lots of people went to prison still in the 1930s for up to 2 years with hard labor. Even if somebody just found a letter from you to another man addressing him as dear.
Yeah, I think that's one of the aspects of pre-mid-60s gay life that a lot of people find astonishing, particularly younger people, but also people who would have had no contact with it, just how clandestine and fear-driven it was. And one of the things that came across to me very much from the book was a real reminder that although witches can bring you privilege in many ways, they, in the case of gay men, certainly didn't buy complete protection. Class was not going to save you. There are some wealthy, well-connected, prominent people who feature in your book who lived in fear, were run out of the country, couldn't pursue careers that they might otherwise have done.
And I suppose that's why I wanted to write the book in a way, because, and incidentally, I should say why it's called the Glamour Boys.
Yes.
The Glamour Boys is a term that was coined by Neville Chamberlain's henchman, a man called Sir Joseph Ball. And basically what happened was, 1937, Neville Chamberlain becomes Prime Minister. The men that I'm writing about are all members of Parliament, Conservative members of Parliament, by 1935. And each of them has their own journey, but they all become passionate opponents of the policy of appeasing Hitler. They feel that we have to go to war with Hitler. Neville Chamberlain wants to appease him, thinks that that's the way to keep Hitler in his box, is to constantly feed him more of what he wants. That's what leads to the Munich crisis and the surrender of half of Czechoslovakia and then the whole of Czechoslovakia, and the Anschluss with Austria and so on. And this group of gay, bisexual, somewhere in between MPs met regularly in one another's houses. Quite often Anthony Eden was there and Churchill, but a significant number of gay men in the room always. Chamberlain hated them, wanted to denigrate them, had their phones tapped, had them followed, had articles written about them in the press like "Why are you still a bachelor?" and called them the Glamour Boys as a way of insinuating something about their sexuality. It was partly to get at Eden and Churchill as well, because it was just a sort of nasty insinuation, a classic kind of political smear. It was quite successful. It was used in lots of the press. And they kept on making all these brave speeches, attacking the policy of appeasement. And then 4 of them decided that they had to fight in the war because they'd argued for the war, and were killed in action.
You mentioned there a character that was completely unknown to me until I read the book, and left a very vivid impression for having so much of what he did at Chamberlain's beckoning, which was Joseph Ball. This is a man that, as I gather, at Chamberlain's initiative, set up an entire newspaper basically to smear political opponents. He'd come out of the intelligence services and was being used by a prime minister against members of his own party. Tell us more about Ball's background and how he came to be involved in all of this.
Yeah, so Joseph Ball, or Sir Joseph Ball, he was knighted by Baldwin, was a intelligence officer in the First World War, and may still have been sort of on the Secret Service, Secret Intelligence Services payroll, I think, even when he was working for Chamberlain. But by the time Chamberlain comes to Downing Street in 1937, he is running a conservative research department, which is primarily aimed, is separate from the main Conservative Party organisation, reports directly to Chamberlain, and is really a dirty tricks operation. He's a spin doctor. He puts stories around the press. He cultivates his own special people. For instance, when Anthony Eden resigns as Foreign Secretary at the beginning of 1938, Joseph Ball tells all the press that he was having a nervous breakdown, suggests to some of them that he was homosexual, and so on. This despite the fact, incidentally, that Joseph Ball was almost certainly, though married himself, homosexual as well. And then Chamberlain gets him to buy up a very influential magazine at the time called Truth, ironically enough. He buys it secretly. It pretends that it is still an independent organization, but it's entirely driven, written, edited, controlled by Joseph Ball on behalf of Chamberlain. It is profoundly anti-Semitic, profoundly homophobic, runs terrible articles attacking members of the Conservative Party who dare to disagree with Neville Chamberlain. And this, incidentally, is worth remembering. This is a time when Neville Chamberlain had a majority in the House of Commons, not a number of seats, a majority of 255. So any Conservative MP going against the Prime Minister is like howled at in the chamber of the House of Commons. And that's why I have such admiration for these men, because even though they knew that they had an Achilles heel, which was their own sexuality, which could land them in prison if, anything got to the press or to the police, even though they knew that they were vulnerable in that way, nonetheless, they kept on rebelling against their own government. And they're a fascinating group of people. It's not just Jack McNamara, who's probably the most, to use a modern anachronistic term, the most kind of out of all of them. I think if you'd met Jack, well, for a start, he used to go to the gym every day. And even Montgomery commented that he was a particularly well-muscled young man. And I'm not sure that Montgomery normally had an eye for that kind of thing. But there's Ronnie Cartland, who is Barbara Cartland's younger brother. Now, we all think we know what Barbara Cartland was like, this kind of pink meringue, as she was in later life, and writing all those hundreds of romance novels. But actually in the early 1930s, she was quite a flighty, naughty, lively, bubbly person. She wrote lots of gossip columns for various different magazines. She ran the best parties. There's a wonderful photograph in the book of her at one of her own parties in a sort of fancy dress outfit, which is quite remarkable. We're trying to get all of this incidentally made into a TV series at the moment. And I'm really looking forward to showing a completely different version of Barbara Cartland to the world.
Fantastic. Oh, yes. As I was saying earlier, she's somebody that we now see as a very conservative old school figure, but actually in the 30s, she would have been daring and shocking.
Well, indeed, she writes about the sex instinct as being a good thing. Those are her words, not mine. And so Ronnie Cartland, he's a Conservative MP. His father had been a Conservative Party political agent and was killed in the First World War. He gets elected in 1935 in one of the Birmingham seats, and that means that he's within the sort of orbit of, or the fiefdom of Neville Chamberlain. But even within months of arriving in the Commons, he's gone on a tour around the whole of the UK looking at the depressed areas, and he tables an amendment to an important piece of legislation which criticises Neville Chamberlain when Neville at this point is still the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And so he's a brave lad with independent views of his own. He ended up, indeed, there's a really key moment in August 1939 when all the group, the Glamour Boys, they were very angry with the Munich Pact the year before, which effectively happened in the summer recess. So when it gets to the summer in 1939, they're terrified that Chamberlain is going to table a long recess so Parliament can go away for a long time, and then Chamberlain will do a deal over Poland or something like that. So they're terrified of that. Chamberlain tables a motion. It says that they're not going to meet again until October. The Labour Party tables an amendment, which incidentally you're not allowed to do these days. No amendments are allowed anymore. But and Ronnie Cartland and the team, they're halfway, and normally the votes on that are not a matter of party discipline. They're known as free votes because it's house business. But halfway through the debate, Neville Chamberlain says he makes it a vote of confidence. He says, I know I have friends in this house who will join me in voting with me. And that sends all it really upsets
that's really going down the gauntlet, isn't it?
Exactly. And the Glamour Boys are furious. They all go out into the lobby and think, oh, well, that's it. That's done. And everybody goes, well, somebody's got to speak. We've got to keep the debate going so that we can get everybody here for the vote. And somebody goes, well, where's Ronnie Cartland? And somebody says, well, he's in the loo. So they go and find him in the loo where he is standing with Churchill. And he's just said to Churchill, there's nothing we can do. And Churchill says, no, now is the time to go in and fight. And Ronnie Cartland goes into the chamber and makes a speech which he hasn't prepared, in which he basically calls Neville Chamberlain a dictator, is howled at by the Tories, but it completely changes the whole atmosphere. And he also says, some of us who have been training in the army all this summer know that we may be going to war soon and we may not be returning. And it's very prescient because a few weeks later, well, obviously, the Chamberlain wins the vote that day, but 3 weeks later, the House is called back because we're going to war. And then in January 1940, Ronnie joins the Royal Artillery. He's off to France as part of the British Expeditionary Force, and ends up being killed in very brave circumstances.
Indeed. Something I've been thinking while you've been talking, Chris. These men were not only bravely speaking out in Parliament against their own Prime Minister, but where were they in relation to what we know of public opinion at the time? And they couldn't be open about their sexuality. Some of them were also Jewish, and we were in a period of fairly intense anti-Semitism. What I didn't have before I read the book is a sense of public feeling about the situation in Germany, in Britain during that period. How popular was the idea of appeasement?
So it's slightly difficult to tell because all we have to go on is what the newspapers wrote. But the newspapers were, I mean, all lined up, as they often are, you know, I mean, and there was no opinion polling at the time. There was a peace ballot, which was done early in the 1930s, 1933, I think, but that pointed in two directions at the same time. It sort of said, yes, we don't want to have another war with Germany, but at the same time it said we would, if necessary, use force to prevent territorial aggression. So you could take it as meaning both directions. What politicians thought public opinion said was no to war, full stop. Right. That's what they all thought. If you look at all the diaries, they all think that public opinion says no to war, come what may. And there was quite a ferocious strain in the Conservative Party in particular, which said another war, if there were another war, it would only be because Jews had wanted it to happen and were organizing for it to happen so that they could make money out of another war because they made weapons and uniforms and things like that. So the anti-Semitism, as you say, was really rife. There's another character I should talk about probably, which is Rob Bernays. And Rob was, as you may know, because the Labour government from 1929 to 1931 collapsed in 1931, and Ramsay MacDonald formed a national government with Conservatives and some Liberals. The government benches was full of Conservatives, National Labour and National Liberal, which is a slightly odd set of concepts. Yeah. Anyway, Rob Bernays was a National Liberal. He supported the government. He eventually became a government minister. But he'd gone to Germany in the early 1930s, seen their gay bars, but also he'd met some of the early gay Nazis, like Edmund Hines and Ernst Röhm, who ran the stormtroopers, was slightly intrigued by them, but terrified of fascism and Nazism, and wrote very strongly about this back in the UK for various national newspapers, long before Churchill did, incidentally. And he was accused when as things moved forward through the 1930s, it got more and more difficult for him to go to Germany because the people who ran Hitler's office described him as a filthy Jew, and things like that. So it did get much more difficult for him. But he, I think, was instrumental in getting a lot of people to understand that whilst there was a new excitement about Nazi Germany, there was a terrible danger about it. And of course, then in 1934, Hitler kills all the gay Nazis in the Night of the Long Knives, which I don't remember when I was at school ever being portrayed in that way. It was just him killing off some people in the ranks. But it is predominantly killing off the gays. And indeed, when Hitler explains to the Reichstag why it all had to happen, he talks about their perversions and how they were worse than apes and things like that. And that's why he had to get rid of them. So his argument was nothing to do with the plot. It was all about their sexuality. And that alerted quite a lot of the people that I write about in the book to the problem of Nazi Germany, that it was a violent, brutal regime, and everybody should be anxious and nervous about it.
Yeah, I mean, I picked up from the book. This was something I was going to ask you about. The Night of the Long Knives was obviously for a lot of the Glamour Boys a real turning point. I mean, you quote Bob Boothby commenting that the Nazis had shown themselves for what they in fact were. But you also point out that the Times reports this with the words, "The Führer has started cleaning up."
Exactly. And they mean that with approval.
Yeah. Yeah.
And of course, you have to... Well, and there's an irony in this, because the Times at the time was owned by one of the Astors. And Nancy Astor's son, by her first husband, Bobby Gould Shaw, had been sent to prison for his sexuality. Never appeared in any of the newspapers because his family owned half the newspapers, and another member of the family was sleeping with another man who owned another chunk of the newspapers. So yes, and I suspect that there was quite a lot of people in the UK a lot of gay men would have thought, wow, right, we know where this is going. And I suppose one of the things I've taken from this is that quite often it's the gays and then the Jews. You know, it's that old line about first they came for the Jews, then they came for the trade unionists, and then they came for me.
Exactly. We're the canaries in the coal mine.
Exactly, yeah.
Indeed. Something else I wanted to ask you. We keep winding up talking about Barbara Cartland. I must have some strange obsession with her. But it struck me, I mean, yes, these people were, we would say, closeted to a large degree. It's not a word they would have used, obviously. But we're talking about probably quite a small social world. Their true natures would have been known or guessed at to a large extent by a lot of the people around them. But they seem to have been very much accepted, certainly by Churchill and by Eden. I mean, you mentioned in the book, Churchill plays the most gracious and heartfelt tributes to the men that died. There are powerful, what we would nowadays call straight allies, in helping us, supporting, or at least protecting these men to some extent. How important are they in this story?
Well, I don't think that Churchill can possibly not have known that Jack McNamara was gay. I mean, gay is, incidentally, I should just say something about these terms. You know, none of them would have described themselves as homosexual or gay. Those were just, the word homosexual was around, but not used very much. It was thought of in a sort of medical term.
Yes, very clinical.
They might have referred themselves to an Urning or a Uranist, which is a more common, or pervert maybe, or queer. Those were words that were around. I mean, it's interesting that sometimes the newspapers loved the irony of, or the kind of double entendre of queer, because they referred to Jack McNamara's queer antics in a by-election, and you think, wonder what they mean there.
It's
also quite funny when he died, that the local newspaper's eulogy was headed, "He loved men," and you're thinking, where are you going with that? I don't quite know what's going on here. But and there was a sense of people would know but not know. That sort of hazy place where you didn't want to know, in a sense, because then that involved you in knowing about a criminal act. And so, yes, lots of people crack jokes about it. There's one occasion when, I can't remember which one of it is, says, "Oh, I've got to go home. I have to think about my youth." And I think it's Nancy Cunard says, "Well, darling, you could have brought him along." and so on. And I think it's Margot Asquith, who's quite an interesting figure, refers to Bob Boothby and says, "Oh, he's not going to become another Nancy, is he?" And that's another double entendre, whether he's becoming Nancy Astor or he's a Nancy boy. So there's a lot of that around, but it's in a very safe place. And this is the issue, I think, for lots of them. Lord knows how you ever met a partner. And one of the things that was a constant paranoia for people at this time was that a homosexual man will be lonely in old age. And I think that's one of the reasons that quite a lot of them married. Rob Bernays married in the Second World War, had 2 sons. He hardly spent any of his leave from the army with his wife, but my working assumption is that in a different era he would have been a gay man who would have lived with another man. But interestingly, of course, I think quite a lot of the families hid quite a lot of this over the years. There's a sort of a sad bit about Barbara Cartland, because one of the eulogies that was written about Ronnie Cartland by a fellow MP was very lovely, very charming. And Barbara included all of it in a little booklet she wrote of his life, apart from one sentence which referred to Ronnie sitting in the chamber and looking flamboyant. And I think that's because she thought that that was a sort of allegation.
Yeah, it's another one of those coded words from the past.
Musical, theatrical. These were used at the time as well.
Yeah, or those words that used to turn up in obituaries and were a little coded reference. Yeah.
TBA.
What I was saying.
He had.
Yeah. Light on his feet and
all
those little phrases.
Yes, and and confirmed bachelor and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. A question one of our audience has put into the chat, and which I was going to ask you: how did researching the book change the opinion that you previously had of some of the people that you found yourself writing about?
Well, so a particular instance, for instance, I referred to Jack McNamara earlier. All the historians in the past have always referred to him being very right-wing and nearly fascist. I think this is based on the fact that they all thought that he was a member of the Anglo-German Fellowship, which was a group that was set up largely with Hitler's personal finances behind it. But Jack was never a member of it. I've been through all the membership details, all the papers for it in various different archives, and there is no mention of him being a member anywhere. Guy Burgess was, but I think that's because he, and as was Kim Philby, incidentally, but I think that's because they were spying. But Jack was not. So, just sometimes doing a bit of research helps. And there's another story about Jack McNamara. He's often referred to as having been a spy. That's because he got into trouble in 1926 in Tunisia. And I think basically that was a sexual sort of encounter that went wrong. And he ended up going to prison, and the Tunisian authorities called it, alleged that he'd been spying, and the British authorities, I think, kind of went along with it because that was better than saying that he'd been trying to have sex with a Tunisian police officer. So that was really good. The thing I didn't know anything about was Chamberlain being such a person.
Insert your adjective of choice at this point. Yeah, he comes across appallingly, disgraceful. I think, as I said at the beginning, my impression before I read the book was of a rather weak, limp, unexceptional man, but he comes across as brutal and very, very pig-headed. I think you describe him at one point as he surrounds himself with people that agree with him, and he's not interested in a counter argument. He takes a while to make his mind up, but once his mind made up, there's absolutely no shifting it.
Yes, he's very, very stubborn. He has very few friends, and one of his favourite activities in life is fishing, is fly fishing, which he does a lot with Sir Joseph Ball. There's been an attempt, I think, over the last 10 years to sort of rehabilitate Chamberlain and say, well, he knew what he was doing. He was really just delaying the moment when we go to war so that we had more airplanes ready and all that. I don't buy that at all. I think he thought that by his own personal charisma, he would be able to sort Hitler out. And I also think that he was profoundly anti-Semitic. So this is one of the other things for me that I've learned, that I guess part of me always sort of assumed that one of the reasons we went to war with Germany was because of the terrible way the Jews were being treated. No. That wasn't the case at all. No. Even the British Medical Association here complained about too many refugees coming from doctors coming from Germany, all of whom would have been Jewish because they were refugees at this time. Yeah. I mean, it's quite remarkable, the anti-Semitism. And Jack McNamara, when he made a speech about Jew baiting, his words, in the chamber of the House of Commons, got spat at that night at the Carlton Club. So it was a world in which our version of why we went to war is a post hoc rationalization. That makes me nervous about politics in the future quite often. I should say that there's one other character that's worth mentioning, I think, Victor Castlet.
Yes.
So Victor was elected earlier in the 1920s, in fact, when he was really quite young. He was a very good tennis player and squash player. He had so much money that he never really bothered too much with his political career, I think. He liked the Commons, and his sister was an MP as well, Thelma Castlet Keir. But he got to know Gottfried von Cramm. Now, if you're a tennis expert, you'll know who that is, but you might not. Gottfried von Cramm lost the Wimbledon men's single final in 1935 to Fred Perry, and in 1936 to Don Budge. Everybody expected, because those two went off to be professional, that the next year Gottfried would win the Wimbledon final. And Victor Castlet had met him in 1933 because they both played in the Wimbledon men's singles. And I think the last MP ever to have done so. And it's very moving because as the time moves on, in 1937, Gottfried gets back from Australia, where he'd been playing tennis. He gets back to Germany and is arrested immediately because although he's married, he's having an affair not only with a man but with a Jewish man, and he's sent to prison for 9 months for moral turpitude in Germany. There's a big campaign by all the tennis stars around the world to get him released and so on. And when he does come out, the first person he comes back to visit is Victor Castlet. And there's a lovely letter there are 3 letters in the Eton College Library, all of which were available to previous biographers, people who've written about Victor Castlet, but never fully used, in which Gottfried says, thank you ever so much for getting my lover out of Germany into originally Portugal and then into Palestine, and saying why he's always refused to join the Nazi party. It's just remarkable how many historians have tried to hide the sexuality of all these people. And I think that their sexuality is an intrinsic part of why they were brave. It's not accidental. They'd already swum against the tide in their private lives, and that made it easier for them to swim against the tide in Parliament.
Yeah, they had to be brave, courageous individuals because actually the world gave them no choice.
Exactly.
Yeah, you said something there that raises another point that fascinates me. I think there are a couple of questions that will kind of roll together here. One is, how difficult was it to research this book? I mean, you talk about the letters being at Eton that historians could have drawn on and have chosen not to, but presumably, given the nature of the times that these men lived in, they would have kept a lot of their life undocumented and secret. And apart from others, they're no longer with us, but there presumably weren't always diaries or letters that were passed down through the generations because they wouldn't have wanted that to happen. And also there's an element that history is written by the people that survive it and wind up on the winning side. And certainly some of the key figures of this book didn't survive it, although they were proved right. How hard a book was this, in a very literal sense, for you to put together?
When I started, or when I first came across the story, I thought there won't be enough documentary evidence to put together a book because they would never have written to one another, and if they did, it would have been burnt. I know that Barbara Cartland destroyed a lot of Ronnie's papers. Rob Bernays' wife, Nan, in later years destroyed some of his letters. But actually, it's been amazing what I've been able to find. I was always very keen not to overstate any argument. And sometimes you have to do a bit of reading between the lines. For instance, Ronnie Cartland's very close friendship with Viscount Nebworth, who gets killed in an aircraft accident. I think it's not too difficult to read with modern eyes what was going on there. But equally, Rob Bernays, I found Rob Bernays' two sons, and they gave me access to all the papers that do still exist, including his handwritten diary, which is really quite useful. I went back to Harold Nicholson's original diaries, the typescript version, which he did every day, which is in the Balliol College Library, and lots of Harold Nicholson has been published, but lots of it hasn't. I mean, it's only about a tenth has been published. So going back to the original, which took forever, but I mean, there was a lot in there that just wasn't of interest to anybody else. Herbert Sharp's great-grandchildren I managed to find through ancestry.co.uk and so on and so on. I mean, I just did manage to end up finding quite a lot of hard factual evidence. And that was, I mean, it was a lot of research, but I loved doing it.
Yeah. And presumably these surviving relatives' views and opinions have changed as society has changed. Men they would have been ashamed of or kept quiet about, now they can see in a rather different light.
Well, one family was a bit split on this, and one half refused to cooperate. But the London Irish Rifles, for instance, who Jack McNamara was their colonel from 1938 onwards, and always wanted to lead them into battle in the Second World War, was never allowed to, because there was a kind of general view that MPs shouldn't be in senior commands, or maybe it was because he was gay, I don't know. Anyway, but he was killed in action in the end. But the London Irish Rifles were really, really helpful, you know, and they're rather proud of the fact that they had a gay commanding officer who indeed changed their outfits. One of the first things he did. He didn't get getting them all wearing kilts. He didn't manage that one. He didn't pull that one off. But it was quite interesting because I then found, you know, I was going through the regimental list and I came across Weg Prosser. Weg Prosser. I know a Weg Prosser. They must be related, and they were. It was his grandfather, and he said, "Oh yes, no, we all knew that." I mean, nearly all the officers in the London Irish Rifle were gay. And then Victor Castlet sets up his an anti-aircraft battery in Sevenoaks in 1939, and it's known as the Monstrous Regiment of Gentlemen or the Buggers Battalion, because nearly everybody in it seems to have been either, well, at least artistic, and possibly more. And some of them, you know, wrote books afterwards in which they were pretty forthright about their sexual adventures and so on. So, you know, there was a space available to gay men in this kind of world, which was kind of exciting. And then, and some of the families are now completely, you know, happy about it. If anything, it's rather nice to have had a great uncle who was a bit of a gay hero. Who was it I spoke to? The Earl of Portarlington, whose father was a great friend of Ronnie Cartland's, and I got hold of him and we chatted on the phone, and I said, "Do you mind if I ask you an indelicate question?" And he said, "You're going to ask me whether my father was homosexual, aren't you?" Bearing in mind the Earl of Portarlington is now 83 or something like that. And I said, "Well, yes, I was going to." And he said, "Well, I haven't the foggiest idea because he died when I was 6. But I can tell you this, his best man was his #1 best friend, and he certainly was Ronnie Cartland." So there's a sort of, you know, the world has moved on and changed, and there was and maybe it was, you know, the time was right for this book because those attitudes have changed so much in such a short time in the UK.
Yeah. And maybe even in some cases that there was private acceptance that couldn't be publicly uttered.
Yes, I'm terribly irritated, however, because I met up with Robert Bernays' son's wife, and she said, "But you missed out on Walter Elliot. You didn't know that Walter Elliot was gay." I said, "No, I had no idea." And Walter Elliot was Rob Bernays' great friend, became Secretary of State for Scotland under Churchill and so on. And she said, "Oh, I can show you the diaries," in which his wife, who was Margot Asquith's sister, she says, Kay Tennant, she was known as, says, bastard couldn't get it up. I know why. It's because I'm not a boy. But I didn't have that for the book. So there you are. You got a new.
Yes, right, bro. That's one to sneak into the TV series, Chris.
Yeah.
We could say that there are other characters that make brief appearances because the book has to cover so much ground. But I went about them. Was Oliver Baldwin, Stanley Baldwin's son, who with a man and working as a journalist and writing quite furiously after the horrendous pro-black shirt Daily Mail article. And I went, oh, now that's interesting. Now there's a character I'd love to know more about. There's so much left to explore here.
There's a biography of Oliver Baldwin, which is fairly forthright. It could have been a more interesting book, I think. But well, there's two funny things about Oliver Baldwin. First of all, you're absolutely right. Lord Rothermere wrote this article, Hurrah for the Black Shirt.
For the black shirts, yeah.
In 1934, the beginning of 1934. And the first two journalists to attack it are Rob Bernays and Oliver Baldwin, both of them homosexual. Everybody at the Mirror always points out that this was in the Daily Mail. It's also true that it was run in the Daily Mirror, the Hurrah for the Black Shirts article. So sometimes you just have to remind the Mirror that they're not quite as pure as they've always been. But the second thing is there's this, as you know, one of the ways Rob Bernays comes into politics at all as a Liberal is because he knows the Earl of Beauchamp. And the Earl of Beauchamp was the leader of the Liberals in the House of Lords. He had been governor in Australia back in 1900 when he was still single. In 1930, he and Rob Bernays go to Australia. By this stage, the Earl of Beauchamp is married, but he doesn't take the Countess with him. He takes the particularly handsome George Roberts, who's a valet. And that gets him into terrible trouble because they're clearly living as a couple in Australia. And the Governor General refuses to allow him to come to the house and reports it all back in the UK. So when Beauchamp comes back to the UK, he's faced with an ultimatum effectively from the King saying, you've either got to leave the country or face criminal prosecution for your homosexuality. And there's a particularly funny moment, or I found it funny, when the Earl of Beauchamp's brother-in-law, so his wife's brother, is a particularly odious, anti-Semitic, hard-right Duke of Westminster. And he is furious when Stanley Baldwin goes to visit the Earl of Beauchamp at their house in known as Maddersfield near Malvern. And Baldwin had gone, and the Duke of Westminster writes to Baldwin, who's the leader of his own political party, and complains in fulsome terms that this is a disgrace. What he cannot positively have understood is that not only was Baldwin's son homosexual, but also they'd gone to Malvern for the consecration of the new Bishop of Worcester, whose son, Stanley Perrown, was also homosexual. So I think Baldwin was quite relaxed about these matters.
Indeed, indeed. A final question, I think, from me before we open up to questions from our audience. As a parliamentarian yourself, how do you value the contribution that the Glamour Boys made as parliamentarians? How essential was their contribution in changing the course of British history in the 30s?
Well,
and
obviously, if you hadn't had Eden and Churchill, we wouldn't have gone to war. But also, Eden and Churchill needed this group of men around them not only to provide the numbers when it came to the division lobbies, but also to provide the kind of emotional clout and the unity and the organizational ability to defy Chamberlain's policy of appeasement. So I think that they were absolutely essential. What's nice for me as an MP is that when Victor Castlet died, Churchill decided that when the Chamber of the Commons was rebuilt after the bombing, which was 80 years ago today, the chamber should have little plaques put up, little shields to each of the MPs who'd been killed in war. There's 23 of them. And it's just at least 4, if not 6 of them were gay or bisexual. And I don't think anybody would have known that until now. And I hope that now every MP will know that. And because I wanted to write the book because I wanted to say all those stereotypes about gay men not being able to catch a ball or fire a gun or being able to show any kind of sustained fortitude, it's just wrong. These men showed the ultimate sustained fortitude, not only in their political endeavors, but also in several cases in going to war.
And having their own government very much lined up against them throughout.
Completely, yes. Yeah.
There's kind of variation on that point has come through as a question from one of our audience, saying how far did these MPs survive because of the rather closed nature of the world of Westminster?
Well, there's an element of that because Churchill referred to Parliament as a masculine assembly. That's one of the things he says to Ronnie Cartland. And he likes it that way, incidentally. I mean, I think Churchill liked the company of men. And that's partly where all the drinking came from. But and yes, it was also as a class thing. You know, they were in a class environment where they were to some degree protected. Apart from anything else, they had, you know, their own accommodation, so they could enjoy a degree of privacy. Though Ronnie Cartland and Rob Bernays were living in bachelor's accommodation next to each other and shared a bathroom. I think you just always had to be careful. You could have a gay old time, and I tried to give a sense of the gay venues you could go to in central London, such as the Savoy, by which I don't mean the restaurant or the hotel or the grill, or for that matter even the Savoy Chapel. I mean the Savoy Turkish baths, which provided an all-night entertainment of many different kinds. I think we'll just leave it at that. And I described some of the bars that they almost certainly went to. But it was quite interesting, you know. If you look at Harold Nicholson's diaries, he's endlessly going to Bouloustin, the restaurant. Well, it didn't take me all that much research to find out that Marcel Bouloustin had written a book called Maurice, which is all about homosexual encounters when he was in Paris, and then lived with his lover, not Adair Turner, that's somebody else, Adrian Turner, for many, many years. So going to dinner at the Bouloustin was like a gay night out, you know. So I've tried to give that impression. And the other thing I've tried to do, I hope well in the book, is give an impression of the drama of the chamber itself. Because I've read so many books of political history, which basically, you know, read out the lines from Hansard, but don't render the drama, and the mood in the chamber can turn on a sixpence, not so much under COVID, but normally, and it did in this period. So I tried to render that kind of drama.
Yeah, I don't know how many of our audience have actually visited the House of Commons, but the first thing that strikes me, we went, my partner and I went on one of the rather wonderful guided tours. And I think the first thing that strikes you is the chamber is actually a lot smaller than you think. That's it's actually quite claustrophobic as a room when everybody's in it, presumably. And you don't even have seats for all of the MPs. There are too many of you. So a full house must be a very intense
When
situation.
Anthony Eden did his resignation speech in 1938, Jim Thomas had to sit on the floor at his feet.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so just putting things like that in, I
Yes,
think helps
gives you
give the
a
real impression of what it felt like emotionally.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. I think one final question from me. We are at 2 minutes to 8, and I know that you have your own partner waiting to serve you dinner. What makes you, what of the story of the Glamour Boys gives you hope for what Parliament can achieve, and what of their story sounds down the ears to you as a real warning that we need to be watchful?
Well, I'll start with the warning, if that's okay.
Yes, of course.
I was very struck that the most liberal place in the world for a gay man in the 20th century was Berlin, round about 1930, 1931. And then by 1937, homosexual men in Germany were being carted off to concentration camps and dying in their thousands. So what I say is that the freedoms and the liberties that we have today are not guaranteed in perpetuity. You have to keep on fighting for them in every generation. You have to reassert them in every generation. And that includes the freedom of democracy and representation and so on. The thing that gives me hope is that an individual MP in the main can't achieve a great deal, but just sometimes if you get together with the right mates, you can change the world.
Yeah.
And that's what they did. They, you know, I mean, and also incidentally, it's fine to go to dinner a lot. That's the other thing.
Probably rather helpful. Depends who you go to dinner with.
Not much, I don't think.
The time at 8 o'clock, unless anybody is going to interject, I think it's time for me to say, will you please all unmute yourselves and give Chris a big round of applause and thank him for a fascinating hour of his company.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.